Today, we're going to regain control of our certificates. No more self-signed certificates, no more odd ports, and no more HTTP. We're going all in with SSL for our external services and for our internal services too. We're going to use wildcard certificates from Let's Encrypt so we can have an unlimited amount of certificates. We're also going to harness the power of DNS internally so we can refer to our services however we like. And then we're going to harness the power of external DNS with a provider like Cloudflare so we can get wildcard certificates. And we're going to do all this with Portainer and Traefik. And then after we get that set up, I'm going to share all of my configurations with you with everything I've learned with setting up a reverse proxy. I've learned a lot while setting up my reverse proxy with Plex, TrueNAS, Pi-hole, Proxmox, SyncThing, Homebridge, and more. And so rather than you spend all of that time figuring that out, I'll share all of my config with you. And if that sounds good to you, give this video a thumbs up, and if you don't like it at the end, you can take it back. So how are we going to do this? First, you'll need a Linux machine. And then you'll need to make sure that Docker's installed on that machine. And that's as simple as running a few commands that you can find in the documentation to copy and paste and follow along with. You should be able to run docker -- version and see a version output. This means Docker's installed and you're on track. Next, we'll need to install Docker Compose. And you should be able to run docker -compose -- version and see a version output. The next thing you'll want to verify is that you have a static IP. Now this could mean that you've hard-coded one on this server, or you have a DHCP lease and reservation for this machine. But either way, you'll want to make sure that your IP address doesn't change. And it's also a good idea to create a local DNS record for this machine too. Now, it's not required, just makes things a little bit easier. And people ask me all the time how I set up my local DNS, and I use Pi-hole. And if you need help with that, I just made a quick video on how to do it in a couple of minutes. But that's as simple as going into Pi-hole and creating a record that points to this IP address. Now notice here that my Portainer server is named portainer.local.technotim.live. Now I own technotim.live, but I've created a subdomain within my domain so that I can refer to this machine internally without that request going external. And so if I do an NS lookup for that machine, portainer.local.technotim.live, I should see a response with my local IP address. So this means it's working. And this is probably a good point to mention that you should own an external domain. The certificates we're going to create belong to this domain, and you'll need to make sure that you own it. It's also a good idea to set this up in Cloudflare. Now you don't need Cloudflare to do this. Traefik supports lots of different DNS providers, but Cloudflare makes it super easy and has a lot of other benefits too. And now we're almost ready to set up Portainer, but we want to do one thing first. First, we want to set up Traefik. Now, what is Traefik? Traefik has many different products, but we're going to install the proxy today. And Traefik's proxy makes exposing services really easy, especially in containers. And it acts like an edge router for all of your containers. And so we're going to set up Traefik as a reverse proxy to connect to our other services on our network. And Traefik also has Let's Encrypt. And Let's Encrypt will let us get our certificates. And then we'll use our DNS provider, Cloudflare in this case, to get wildcard certificates for Traefik. So this will allow us to provision any number of sites we have internally using this wildcard certificate. And so before we set up Portainer, we want to set up Traefik first so that Portainer can use some of the labels from Traefik so that our Portainer server also has SSL. And again, don't worry, I'll share all of my configuration so you can copy and paste it. So let's set up Traefik first. So back in our server, the one running Docker, let's create a folder first for Traefik. And then in here, let's create a data folder. And so if we look at our server, we should have a Traefik folder, and then inside of there, have a data folder. Then we'll want to cd into our data directory and create an acme.json file. This will hold our certificates. And then we'll set some permissions on this file, a 600. Then we'll create our traefik.yaml file, and this is our Traefik configuration. So now that we created that configuration, we actually need to put some config inside of it. And here's what our Traefik configuration looks like. It's pretty basic, but it works like this. First, we have an API key, and the API is the Traefik API. And we're telling it to allow the dashboard, so we're going to host our Traefik dashboard. And then we're going to turn debug on so we get some additional logging. Next, we have two entry points, one for HTTP and one for HTTPS. And then we're allowing insecure certificates to be in between. Now I know this sounds scary, but this is pretty common. And so what this will allow us to do is put our reverse proxy and our SSL in front of another server that has a self-signed certificate, which is the case with a lot of services that are out there, like Proxmox. And so we're going to turn that on so we can still proxy through Traefik to get to those services. And next, for providers, we're using Docker, so we're binding to the Docker socket, and then we're providing our config file, which we haven't created yet, but we will here in a few. And then we're supplying our certificate resolver. So this is whoever owns your DNS. For me, it's Cloudflare, but Traefik supports a lot more providers than Cloudflare. And if you're using anything else, it's as simple as looking at their documentation and providing some additional keys. But for me, I use Cloudflare. So then it uses the ACME key with an email, which would be your DNS provider account email, storage, or a file where our certificates are going to be written, and then who our DNS provider is. In my case, again, it's Cloudflare. And then we'll have to set up some resolvers. And so these resolvers are pointed at Cloudflare's resolvers. Now you might think to put your internal DNS here, and that might work in some cases, but I found that I need to use the external resolvers, so point directly at their DNS, for this to work. The next thing we'll need to create is our Docker Compose file. Now our Docker Compose file is a way to instantiate or create a Docker container. And this is why we installed Docker Compose earlier. Now you can do this without Docker Compose. You can use it with the Docker CLI, but you'll end up creating a ton of labels if you can't tell by this YAML file. And so I found that it's a lot easier to use Docker Compose because 1, you have a manifest that you can hold on to for later, and 2, it's a lot easier to copy and paste this into an editor like VS Code rather than a terminal session. And so I'll walk through this, but I'll only call out the highlights so you don't gloss over. But this is our Docker Compose for Traefik. We're going to use the Traefik image of latest. We're going to name it Traefik. We're going to restart it unless it stops. Typical Docker stuff. We're going to expose some ports on it, so do some networking here. We're also going to pass some environment variables to it. Now these are going to be your Cloudflare account and your Cloudflare API key, but if you use a different DNS provider, it's going to be those. But here you would pass in your account information. Then we're going to map some volumes, and so these volumes map from the host to this container. So mappings for time zones, for Docker. So the path to our Traefik YAML file we just created, we're saying it has read-only access. And then the path to our new certificate file, this ACME JSON file, and we're giving it read-write access since we don't specify. And then a path to our config file, which we haven't talked about yet, and then we're giving it read-only access. And next are our labels, and this is why I was saying it's a lot easier to do it in YAML. I don't think I've ever said that before, something's easier in YAML. But anyway, this is a lot easier than copying and pasting the CLI command with lots of additional labels. You can just do it here in an editor. And so there's a lot going on here, so I'll just call out the highlights. But these are the routers and the rules that I found that I needed to work with all of my services, so you don't have to figure this out later. But the highlights are, first of all, we're exposing our dashboard on this DNS name. So mine's called Traefik-dashboard-internal.local.technotim.live. This can be anything you want, but just make sure that you have a DNS entry pointing back to this Portainer server. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Next is our password to see the dashboard. And this is in basic auth. And so we'll need to generate a password for this and paste it in here. And rather than talk about that now, I'll have those commands in the documentation just in case you don't turn on the dashboard. Next, we have headers, redirects, and a lot of additional stuff for Traefik. Then we have all of our redirect rules for Traefik, so that if something comes in on HTTP, it's going to redirect it to HTTPS automatically. Then once again, we have our cert resolver, and so mine is Cloudflare, so you'll need to make adjustments if you use a different provider. And next is where the magic happens. So this is where we get our certificates. So here, I'm requesting a certificate for local.technotim.live, and then I'm also requesting a SANS, or a subject name alternative, for a wildcard of any subdomain hanging off that. Now originally, going into this, I thought I could get a wildcard certificate for all subdomains, but it doesn't work that way. I learned that you can only get a certificate for one level deep. So this was the easiest way that I found to do it, was just ask for a certificate for this local subdomain, so that I can get wildcard certificates for any subdomain. So any domain hanging off of local.technotim.live. And just to reiterate, these are for internal services only. And we'll configure these services in our Traefik config. And then another call out really quick is this network down here. And this networks is actually really important, this network called Proxy. So we're creating a Docker network called Proxy and saying external is true. So what this does is allow our Docker containers to also use this network, so that when we come in through the reverse proxy of Traefik, it can route it to these containers on that same network called Proxy. And that's how we get SSL. But they don't only have to be services within Docker. And I'll show you that here in our config. So let's spin up Traefik first and make sure it's working. First, let's create that network, the one I called Proxy. So it's Docker network create, and then the network name is Proxy. And then let's go back into the root of that Traefik folder, and let's copy and paste that Docker Compose file here so that we can run Docker Compose and spin it up. So you'll want to copy and paste your Docker Compose file to this folder, or you'll want to rsync it or get it there somehow and save it. Then we'll want to go into the data folder and modify our Traefik config. And you'll want to do the same thing, copy and paste the contents from traefik.yaml to that file, or rsync it there or get it there somehow. Another thing we'll need to create is our config.yaml. And so this config is a config that will end up passing to Traefik with all of our routes. Now we don't need anything in there now, we just need to make sure it exists when the container spins up. That's as simple as just doing a touch config.yaml. And now, if we do an ls, we should make sure that we see config.yaml, a data folder, which houses our Traefik config, as well as our certificates, and then a docker compose.yaml file. And if you see all this, we can spin this up. So we can run a docker compose up-d. This will create our container, and now it should be running. You can check by running docker ps. And we see our container here. And to see our dashboard, all we need to do is go to that domain name that we specified in the config. So for me, it was traefik-dashboard-internal.local.technotim.live. And now I'm prompted for our basic authentication password. And if you provide that password, you should now see your Traefik dashboard. First things first, dark mode. Always dark mode. There we go. But what's more awesome than our dashboard and dark mode is that we actually have our wildcard certificate now. So let's check. If we go into certificates and we check our certificate, you can see I'm using a wildcard certificate from my domain, technotim.live. It's actually local.technotim.live. And this is why we added a subdomain in front. So these are all routed internally. They don't resolve externally. And so now that we have our Traefik container running, with our dashboard running, and SSL certificates, now let's get Portainer running and put a certificate in front of that. It's super easy to do. So back in our server, let's create a new folder for Portainer. And this is going to be at the same level as Traefik is. So you can see the pattern here. All of my containers have their own folder. So we'll make a directory called Portainer. In here, we'll create a Docker Compose. And in here, we'll create a folder called data. And then for that Docker Compose file, we'll need to put some contents. And you guessed it, more YAML. And so here's what our Docker Compose YAML looks like. We're using the image Portainer, we're naming it Portainer, and then we're gonna restart it unless we stop it. And we're setting some security policies as well. And then networks. Notice proxy network. And so this is how, when you come in the reverse proxy, it can route to this Docker container because it goes over the network called Proxy and then to Portainer. And this is the really cool thing about Traefik. It's a container. And so then we're gonna set some volume, so time zone stuff, Docker stuff to map to Docker, and then a folder that we just created, data. And then again, we have all of our labels that we talked about. We're gonna use these labels for all of our containers running on that Portainer machine. The only thing we're usually gonna change is right here, our host rule and then our secure redirect to that host. And so for me, I'm naming my server portainer.local.technotim.live. And again, you'll have to use DNS to create that DNS entry and point it back to this machine, this Portainer machine, so it can get routed appropriately. So this says, hey, when you see portainer.local.technotim.live come to this machine, route it to this container, to the internal load balancer on port 9000. And port 9000 sounds familiar, right? It's Portainer's port. So it's routing it to this machine through Traefik, through this Docker proxy network, to port 9000 on this container, and then serving it out securely. So let's copy and paste this or transfer it to that machine, and then we'll save it, and then we'll do the same thing, Docker compose up-d. So it pulled down the image, created the container, and now we're done. Now normally, we would go to this machine on port 9000, but since we created Traefik, it should have automatically created a route for us so that we can go to it through the reverse proxy. So before we go there, let's look at the dashboard first. So if we go back to our dashboard and go under HTTP, because this is a reverse proxy, so it's HTTP traffic, we now see that Portainer has a route and it has TLS. So this is really awesome. So let's go to Portainer over HTTPS now. And if we go to that DNS entry over SSL, we can now see Portainer's running. And if we look at our certificate, it's the same certificate. That's the cool thing about Wildcard certificates. Now we can create an unlimited amount of subdomains under this domain and have SSL. And so when it created this route, it didn't even go out to let's encrypt and request another certificate. It just applied it to this route. So super awesome. So let's create our user and let's manage the Docker API. So connect, and here we have Portainer running. And if we go under this local machine and then go to containers, we can see our Traefik container here. So really cool, we can manage it from here now too. Okay, so we got Traefik up and going. We got SSL certificates. They are wildcards. We know how to add additional containers and have those route through the reverse proxy and use our SSL certificate. But now, how do we use an external service? How do we proxy through this machine and get to something like Proxmox? Super easy, and I'll show you. Now the reason I'm using Proxmox as an example is because it's a little more challenging than the rest. But we'll take care of all of the challenging things in this one with some headers and some additional middleware so that you don't have to deal with additional services that also require that middleware for those headers. And again, just a reminder in case you're skipping through the video, all of this will be included in the documentation so that you can use this one config and it'll work with most of your Homelab services. And I highly encourage you, if you find more, to open pull requests on this repo to add additional services that are common across most people's Homelabs. So back on our server, in our Traefik folder, remember we created that empty config.yaml? It should be right here in the root of Traefik. And if we edit that, we shouldn't see anything there. This is where config is going to go. So this is config for the actual reverse proxy and our routers and any additional networking that we need to apply to the Traefik service. So it's empty now, so let's add some config to it so we can get to our Proxmox server. Okay, so what does that config look like? I've reduced it down to the most simple version of this that I could instead of confusing you with all of my config. And here's how it works. First, we have a config. So this is a config for HTTP, so a config for our reverse proxy. Then we have some routers. So this is the incoming request. How does it handle that incoming request? Well, I'm saying, hey, the entry point is going to be HTTPS, and the entry point is going to be pve1.local.technotim.live. So this is the domain name that I want to refer to this machine as. So my Proxmox server, I don't want to refer to it by IP address anymore or weird port. I want to refer to it by this new DNS name. Again, you'll have to create a DNS entry for this. And so I created a DNS entry for pve1.local.technotim.live, but I didn't point it at my Proxmox server. This might sound confusing. I pointed it at this Portainer server because this is my reverse proxy. So this DNS entry right here should not point at the service you want to go to. It should be pointed at this reverse proxy, this Portainer server, or this Traefik container. Did I drill that in yet? But you want to make sure that points to this server and not your destination. That's coming up. And so we're going to add some middleware of default headers. And so what's our middlewares? Our middlewares are right here. So we're going to do an HTTPS redirect. So anything coming in on HTTPS is automatically going to get redirected to HTTPS. Then we have some default headers we add to all of these requests. And this took a lot of experimentation to figure out. And that's why I started with Proxmox, because Proxmox does have some additional custom headers that it needs to know about in order to work. Because if you think about Proxmox, it's not only going to the HTTPS endpoint to get to the server and to view all your stats, it's also remote controlling that in a web VNC session. So I figured it out so you don't have to. And then TLS, this is always empty. Our service is called PVE1. This can be called whatever you want. It should match this PVE1 up here generally. And then our service, which we're referring to, is PVE1. So this is the key between these two. These two absolutely have to match, otherwise it won't find the service. We're creating a load balancer, and the URL that it's gonna route to is actually now the IP address of your Proxmox server. And I purposely left this as an IP address. You could use DNS here as well, but I left it as an IP address just so it's really obvious. And so this URL will be the IP address and port of the destination you're going to. So in this case, for us, it's our Proxmox server. And then we'll pass some host headers equals true. And then down here, the default whitelist or allow list in our IP allow list is just a range. And you can choose whether or not to adopt this, but I'm basically saying, hey, all private networks can get to this. Now you can constrain this or remove it altogether, but for me, this just ensures that only IP addresses for whatever reason that are internal are going to be able to get to this, and not IP addresses from the outside. And then here's how it's secured. Secured chain middlewares, and then our default whitelist and our default headers. So this is all we need to apply now to Traefik to actually create this new route to get to our Proxmox server. So let's do that. So we're gonna edit that config YAML for Traefik, and we're gonna paste that config in here, or you rsync it here, however you wanna do it. Then we'll save it. So we can do this a couple ways. What I usually do is just force the recreation of the container. And why do I do that? It's because when the container gets created, it's going to look for that config in the /config folder and bring that container up with that new config file that we just created. So the way I do it is just docker-compose up-d and then -- force recreate. Right or wrong, that's how I do it. So we're recreating that Traefik container. Now it's pulling in the new config, and now we should have a new route if we go back into our dashboard. And after going back to our dashboard, if we go into HTTP, we should see our new route. So here it is, host pve1.local.technotim.live. So this means we should now have SSL for our Proxmox server. So let's check that out. And if we go there to pve1.local.technotim.live, we should see our Proxmox server. And you'll notice we don't have any odd ports on the end, and we don't have any certificate warnings. If we look at our certificate, it's the same certificate we've been using the whole time, our Wildcard certificate. And if we sign into our server, it should, well, if I get my password right, and if we get our password right and sign into our server, we should now see our dashboard. And here's something that should also work that wouldn't work if you didn't use my guide, is VNCing in or remoting in to this server. It's something that took me a long time to figure out. And so there are lots of nuggets like that in my configuration that are on my GitHub site and in the documentation site. So I highly encourage you to use those instead of figuring out yourself. And if you figure out some more options, feel free to open a pull request. And with this now, you can host all of your Homelab services with SSL using Portainer and Traefik. And you can also use this for external services as well. It would be as simple as port forwarding 80 and 443 to this machine. But no, with that comes risks. So are you running Portainer or Traefik? Are you running Nginx Proxy Manager or just plain old Nginx? Do you think this is a little bit easier to set up? If so, let me know in the comments section below. And remember, if you found anything in this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. What services do you want to run? And so when you start to build up your foundation, you got to think like, don't get me wrong. Like, I love the journey. I love building up, hardware and then putting software on top of that, building in redundancy and layering on like all of this cool tech. But you always have to keep your mind, you always have to think about the end product. What is the end product or the end goal? I'm thinking of this more like product management or software development. You're building this platform to eventually do something. And what is that something you want to do? Maybe it's host game servers. Maybe it's host web services. Maybe it's hosting a bot or hosting some code you wrote or a website or a blog. So remember to always keep that in mind. Is